Well, this is it. This is our final message in our 10-week series. And first of all, I want to thank anyone who has, for those of you who have made it through with me and gone the whole way through this series. Again, I'm sorry that we were unable to meet in person. And of course, I miss all of you very much. And hopefully, sometime in the future, we'll get to see you again. But I'm at least pleased that we had an opportunity to do this and still to be engaged in some way. This being the last and final message, I intend for this. All of these messages have, generally speaking, hit a theme or to some extent. And this is, I mentioned that it might be kind of like a bonus message in the last one, sort of in the sense that we've talked about how the Lord fights our battles, and we need to allow Him to fight those battles and have faith and invoke the activity of the second party. So we've talked about that, and today I want to talk about what might prevent us as a final message. What might prevent us from allowing God to take over and to give Him authority in our lives, to what might prevent us from relying on Him. And we're going to deal with that, especially in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Chapter 6, this is a pretty pivotal moment in the history of Israel. And in the previous chapters, you've had David and Saul who've they've gone at it. And they've been, Saul has hated David. I think I said David and Saul, yeah. And so Saul hates David and tries to kill him quite a number of times. Tries to find ways to get at him. The number one thing that had caused God's grace to be removed from Saul was this issue of pride, and we see that pride come into fruition when David goes out and he kills Goliath. And then the people start chanting the praise that Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000s. And ever since that moment, when Saul started to hear that, it invoked a sense of pride in him, and he burned with anger against David. And since that day, you can see as Saul tries to kill David quite a number of times, tries to find ways in order to trick David. And so, but then by the end of that whole scene, and that becomes important later in the message, but then by the time you get to chapter 5, we see in the very first part of that chapter that David becomes king of Israel. So now David is king, and from the verse 6 down through verse 15, we see that David wins this great victory where he takes back Jerusalem, which is a very staple victory. And then after that, the Philistines come and they hear that David's become king. So the Philistines think, well, if we're gonna, and nations did this a lot, where whenever there'd be a new king, an opposing or an enemy nation would see that as an opportunity to test whether or not the king was weak and whether or not they could defeat the nation. And so the Philistines do this. They march out for battle. They fight David. And the Lord fights the battle, and the armies of God prevail. But then you get to chapter 6, and you get to a point where David, you get the sense that he's becoming overconfident. He's beginning to get it in his head that the victories that he has won because he has won them rather than God has won them, which is actually the path that Saul started to go down. And that's where things started to really digress. So now David is going to be faced with the same issue. And in chapter 6, he's going to have to come to grips with the reality that it is the Lord who fights the battles. And you see this because David goes to pick up, after he's won these two victories, he goes to pick up the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is in a place right now where it's about 2 miles away from the Philistine or the Philistine territory or the enemy territory who they've been fighting. And what you see in verse 1 of chapter 6, it says, David again brought together all the able men of Israel. 30,000. Now, first of all, when he says all the able young fighting men of Israel, the word able men, it's the word elite. It's the idea that he goes and gets the best of the best of the best. These aren't just farmers, these aren't just, other people of different trades. He goes and gets the elite fighting force of Israel as if to show strength. And instantly, you get the sense that David is forgetting that the strength of Israel comes not from its fighting men, its elite fighting force, but Israel's strength has always come because God has been on their side. And that's the crux of the issue in chapter 6. So David goes, because I would also point out that the Ark of the Covenant needs no protection. That God protects the Ark of the Covenant. So they didn't need any protection, but David gets it into his head. He gets the fighting force of Israel, and he goes out to pick up the Ark of the Covenant and watches the story unfolds. So first what they do, verse 3, it says they set the Ark of God on a new cart and brought it to the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. So first of all, it says that they take the Ark of God and they put it on a cart. Now, in the Old Testament, that would have been something similar to sacrilege, because what they've done is, in the law of God, there were very specific rules for the way that they were to carry the Ark of the Covenant. They were supposed to have the Levites, and they were to take the Ark of the Covenant actually had these poles on both sides because it was meant to be carried, and it was meant to be carried by the Levites and the priests. So that's what they were supposed to do. But instead what they do is they take the Ark of the Covenant and they put it on a new cart, which is something that would have been more common for, like, if the Philistines were to have gotten the Ark of the Covenant. That would have been something that the Philistines would have done. That is not something that the Israelites should have ever done. It was directly against the law of God. So automatically you see this sense of lightheartedness regarding the Ark of God. They're not treating the Ark of God as it was intended to be treated. So then what you see in verse at the end of verse 3, the part I haven't read, that Uzzah and Ahio, or Ohio, or whatever you want to say, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the Ark of God on it, and Ahio, I think is how you pronounce it, was walking in front of it. David and all of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with harps and lyres, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out with his hand and took hold of the Ark of God, because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark. Now, that's a very challenging passage to struggle with, because you, at one perspective, you might want to look at Uzzah and say, what did he do wrong? I mean, the Ark of the Covenant, the oxen stumbled, the Ark of the Covenant was about to fall over, and so Uzzah reaches out his hand to steady the ark. And God calls that an irreverent act. Now, first of all, the whole tone of what's been taking place up to this point is that Israel is showing irreverence toward the Ark of God, and they're treating it cheaply. Maybe at this point I would just say that we should never treat God cheaply. We should never treat God as common. And I think what is taking place here is that Uzzah is treating God with this irreverence, or treating the Ark of the Covenant as if it's something common. And all of Israel is doing this. And so God's anger burns against Uzzah, and they kill, and Uzzah dies. I've been trying to think, like, what are the things in our society today, or in our churches, that we would do? What are the things that we do in which we treat God as cheap, and we treat God in an irreverent way? And I think one of those ways in which we do that is when we limit God, limit our access to God and God's access to us to a Sunday morning and a Wednesday night. I think when we limit God and say, you know what, like you can have Sunday morning and you can have, in fact, you can have the whole day on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday, and you can have Wednesday night, but the rest of the week it's mine. I think what we do there is we treat God as common, someone to be used. We do this all the time. You know, I think the saying is there was never a atheist in a foxhole hole, and it's because people, when they're coming to a very challenging place in their life, it's much easier to call out on God and ask for God to help you. But when you do that, and you say, well, you can have access to these troubling times, but I'm just going to use you to fix my troubles, and then you don't get access the rest of the time. What you're doing is you're treating God as common. Now, when you're going through struggles and going through hard times, those are times in which we should call out to God, and oftentimes those are moments in which we come to faith, and that's a beautiful thing. But the problem stems when we call out to God during those troubles sometimes, and then after those troubles sometimes we say, you know what, I had you for that moment, that was when I needed you, I'm going to do my own thing now. I think that's treating God as common, as cheap, as being used. And that's what David and the Israelites are doing. They're treating God as common, they're treating God as cheap. And so then what we see is that in verse 8, it says that David was angry because of the Lord's wrath that had broken out against Uzzah. And to this day, he called that place Perez Uzzah, which literally means that God struck Uzzah down. And then you see in verse 9, it says, David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the God ever come to me? He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord and then David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord with him to the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. So first of all, I want to point out that the Israelites treated God as cheap, as common, but and there is a sense in which we need to have a reverent fear of God, that we need to have a reverence where we don't misuse him, we don't use him just for our own purposes. We need to have that reverence, that holy fear. We've got to have that so that we do not treat God as cheap. So then David, he's afraid and says, well, I can't bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem or the city of David. And so what he ends up doing is he sends the Ark of the Covenant to Obed-Edom, who has it for 3 months. And you might think, okay, well then Obed-Edom, he's going to be either struck down or God is going to lash out at him in some way. But that's not what God does, because God is not that way. God is not a cruel God. God is a loving God. God is an understanding God. No, we shouldn't be treating God as irreverent and cheap, but when we treat God as reverent and we treat God with honor and the glory that he has, what ends up happening is that Obed-Edom, his life is blessed, and he experiences such good things that in verse 12, King David was told this. It says in verse 12, now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and everyone he has, because of the ark of God. So David went up to bring the ark of God to the house of Obed-Edom, to the city of David with rejoicing. So then David says, like, oh, whoa. So Obed-Edom is blessed, and now that I know that Obed-Edom is blessed and that God is blessing him, I want that blessing. So he goes up, and I think here's what's happening. I think David is realizing, he's had 3 months to think through this, but he's realizing that the way that they treated God was cheap and it was irreverent. And then David comes to this realization that no, God isn't out to just get us. God isn't out just to strike us down. God is out to bless us. And then he goes, and when he goes, watch the tone of this, because the first time it was irreverent, 30,000 fighting men, but watch the way that they go the second time. Completely different than the first time. Verse 13. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken, so first of all, did you notice they carried the ark of the covenant? So that's how they were supposed to do it. They were supposed to carry it on their shoulders. So they do it right this time. So when those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed. I lost my spot. He sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. So instantly you see that this is not a fighting force, that they didn't come with a fighting force, but this time they came with the proper respect of the toward God, and they sacrifice it. And then in verse 14 it says, then wearing a linen ephod, which by the way would have been like it would have been a priestly garment. So instead of coming in like a military garb, David comes in a priestly garment. David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all the Israelites were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched him from a window, and when she saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. So first of all, what you see is that they finally come, and they come with reverence. They come with proper respect. David is wearing a priestly garment, and they are celebrating this entry of the Ark of the Covenant. And they don't come with military, because the Ark of the Covenant doesn't need protected. God protects himself. And then when they get there, Michal, the daughter of Saul, notice that. So first of all, Michal was married to David, and it all happened because Saul, way back when Saul started to get this pride in his heart, and when people started saying Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000, that pride entered his heart, and an evil spirit, the spirit of God left him because of that pride, and then an evil spirit came into him, spirit of anger, spirit of resentment, spirit of pride. And so all of those things start to happen. And one way in which Saul concocts, it's an idea he concocts to destroy David, is he actually tries to marry his daughters off to David. So the first way he does it is he tries to get his first daughter to marry him, and David says no. But then the second daughter, he tries to get David to wear that, and so but he knows that David's not going to just marry his second daughter, his daughter Michal. And so what he does, he tells David that he has to go and kill so many Philistines, and bring back trophies in order to show Saul that he's killed them and earn his place. David has to earn his place. And it's careful to note that there's a big contrast between David and Saul, because with Saul there was this pride, and it was this sense of I want to kill or hurt or devalue David, but it was all stemming from pride. But David, when Saul tries to marry him off to both of his daughters, he says, "Who am I? I'm not worthy." And so you sense this humility that David had, which I also think is why David was a man after God's own heart. I also think it's why that God chose David over against his brothers, because he was a man of humility. And we see him struggling with this humility as he becomes king in chapter 6, and he's realizing this humility. And then that's why when he comes as a priest, instead of this king of kings, he comes as a priest, and he's celebrating God as if to say, God is even bigger than me as a king. God is bigger and better than I am. And he shows this worship and this respect for God. But then you see Michal, who's married to David, and the scripture describes her as the daughter of Saul. The scripture doesn't say the husband of David, which is what we might think they would say. It says that it's Michal, the daughter of Saul. And I think they're saying that because Michal, the daughter of Saul, dealt with the same spirit of pride that Saul had. And it was perhaps passed down to Michal, and Michal still had that pride. And that's why she is, when in verse 16, when David comes back, she despises him in his heart. And listen to what else they said in verse 17. They brought the ark of the Lord, and it was set in its place inside the tent of David, that they had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israel, both men and women, and all the people in their home. All the people went to their homes. Then watch this. Then David returned home to bless his household. So first of all, David blesses all of the people. The Ark of the Covenant's here, so David blesses the people. Then he comes to his household to bless his household, where Michal is. So verse 20. Then David returned home to bless his household. Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself this day, going around half naked in the view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would do." So get the idea here. I mean, what Michal is saying to David is that she's having this contempt for him, saying, in essence, this is not how a king should act. And Michal should know, because you see, she has had her own dad be the king, and that's not how Saul acted. This is not how a king acts. A king would come in military garb and would come on a horse, and so you see this sense that she's realizing this is not how a king should act, and she says, "You've gone around half naked," which, by the way, some people I think misunderstand that to think that David was fully naked. It says half naked, and he was in the priestly garbs. There would have been priestly undergarments, which would have been modest. But she's saying this is not how a king should act. And then David responds in verse 21. David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone else in his house when he appointed me rule over the Lord's people. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in high honor." And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children until the day of her death. So what David comes to realize at the end of the end of chapter 6 is he says, at first he comes and he's struggling with pride, and he says, "I've got the military force and all that stuff." He comes as the proper king. And he comes to a point where he says, "I'll be humiliated in my own eyes, and I will embrace that humility." And because he embraced his humility, and because he embraced the humility before God, and he didn't treat God as common, and instead he had proper reverence for God, because of that, he is blessed by God, and God blesses him and his household. And then you see in chapter 7, God makes all these promises to David, and Israel is blessed as well. Not just David, but even the people around him are blessed. So we've been talking about this whole thing where we've been talking about how the Lord fights our battles. And I think there's one single thing that would prevent us from allowing God to fight our battles. And I think pride is that thing. And I think it's so easy for us to get thrown into this idea that we can do it by ourselves. We get it in our heads that, well, I don't need it. I got this. Sometimes we think it with the big things, and sometimes we think it with the little things. But regardless of what we think, we come to a place where we say, you know what? I got this. I can do this. And sometimes we have all of the talents, and we have all of the 30,000 elite fighting men around us that would make us puff ourselves up and make us feel, you know what? I don't need God. But what we find is when that happens, destruction ends up coming. And that's why you get the saying, pride comes before the fall. But instead, David realizes his pride, and he rejects his pride. And he comes back with a repentant spirit. And he comes and he is humiliated in his own eyes, and he says, "I'll become even more undignified than this." So at the end of this series, what I would encourage you to do is, one, live your life with the Lord, and don't feel like you need to fight your own battles. It's so exhausting fighting your own battles. Just lean on him and Number two, don't let anything else get in your way. Don't let pride get in your way. Don't let sin get in your way. Don't let that get in your way, because God wants to bless you. God wants every spiritual blessing to be poured out in your life. So if you could just open up your life, open up your heart to him, I believe he wants to do some incredible things you've never even imagined. He wants to bless you in ways you never would have thought of before. And I don't necessarily mean in terms of finances, money, prosperity, gospel, not that kind of stuff, but he wants to bless you and make you better. He wants to do that which is eternally beneficial for your life. Not just temporarily beneficial, but eternally beneficial for your life. So embrace Jesus. Thank you so much for all that you've done to be a part of this message series. And even though this is not ideal, I thank you so much for having the patience to listen, having the patience to look at the handouts that we have and maybe have those discussions, or just to think through it yourself. So thank you so much for all of your time and having me as your evangelist for the week, even if it is at a distance. So God bless you, and I pray that you have a good camp and that you've had a good camp. I mean, I've been praying for you throughout the week. God bless.